Hey guys, before we get started with today's PerfBytes episode, here's a word from our generous sponsor, Flood.io. Imagine your load test plan runs great with just 10 threads, but now you need 100,000 users. Distributed load testing seems like a good idea, right? But now you're wrestling with out-of-memory errors and blocked RMI ports, and your load generators outnumber the target servers for JMeter. You are throwing knives in the dark with limited feedback and Mandralic reporting. Say hello to Flood.io. Launch Flood Test using JMeter or Gatling, view and share test results in real time, scale out your own grid across the globe in minutes. Flood.io, distributed load testing for everyone.
It's time for PerfBytes.
What the is PerfBytes?
The fourth square meal of the day.
Don't look like PerfBytes.
Waffles.
Microwave ready.
Blah, 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 blah,
Add
blah.
nutritional value to your brain.
It's time for PerfBytes with your hosts Mark Tomlinson and James Pulley.
PerfBytes.
Whatever.
Hey, it's time for PerfBytes once again, my PerfBytean listeners, you PerfByters, PerfBytoidal beings. We're back for the continuation of the last week's episode with our friend and guest host, Tim Coopens, and of course, with my regularly geodesic co-host, James Pulley. James, how are you?
I'm doing great, Mark. I'm excited that we're microwave ready.
We are. Of course we're microwave ready. You can. Yeah, I wouldn't recommend reheating, though. That's not okay. Advised. That's not really the purpose of the whole idea there, really.
Oh, okay.
All right, so we are coming back after this great session we had. This is part 2. The topic we have is vUser tips and tricks. This is going to be part 2. Plus, for all you know, James and I will throw in a few bonus tips if we scratch our heads and figure out just about scripting virtual users. But James, it's the end of the year. Not a whole lot going on in the news world. So maybe we'll change the news topic this week to be what's not news.
Or you could state that this is news that we forgot to include earlier, and now we're picking it up, or not news, as the case may be. There are a couple of news items to cover,
which are kind of not news. They're newsworthy, but they're not really.
They're on the networking front, and performance testers tend to be in one or two camps. They're in the networking camp or they're the application camp. We speak mostly to the application camp, but we do need to let people know when we have some new tools on the networking side of the house.
Yes.
So tool number 1 that we missed was an update to the SIP-P performance testing tool. For those of you who are familiar with the session initiation protocol, which is used by a large number of chat applications as well as PBXs for handshaking with your VoIP hardware and software. Version 3.4 is the current release, and we missed that back in late October. So this is just kind of a pickup in that case.
Yep.
And continuing on the networking front, Ixia Communications in Calabasas, California, announced that it has completed its previously announced acquisition of NetOptics, which is a kind of a tool suite in the application and network visibility side of the house. So think of a competitor to a traditional S&P management solution stack. That's kind of where they play in that case. So on the network visibility front. And Mark, I think there were a few other things that were kind of pickups. Number 1 is our PerfBytean colleague and friend Scott Barber has joined SmartBear.
Or seems to have joined up with SmartBear, and he's blogging a bunch of their stuff and some interviews and stuff, which is pretty cool. And SmartBear is traditionally, I think they mostly do dev testing and developer kind of stuff, but they do have, there's the SOAP UI, and I always run into people trying to do load testing with SOAP UI, and it never goes well. So then they try Load UI, and they can do pretty good, but they're not like Gatling. They're not as, super scalable site. But hey, maybe the news here is that Scott's joining up with those guys, and we should see what's maybe something's going to happen there in
So
2014.
what you're saying is we should watch Mr. Barber carefully to see what he's up to.
Yes, they might have invited him into the lab. See what I'm brewing in the lab. Sorry.
Interesting. I wonder if he'll throw in a couple of ingredients.
He might. Barberesque. Exactly.
Yeah.
It'd be very good. Hey, the next sort of not news thing was HP Discover last week. HP Discover 2013 in Barcelona. They wrapped up last week, and there was only really one big announcement, and that was Vertica and the big data stuff. And a few other. I saw some of the videos, which were pretty awesome. But we're always looking for the hot news about Load Runner and Performance Center coming out of the HP world, and I didn't see anything, really awesome, new changes.
Well, Mark,
virtual
it's kind of hard to fold that whole QA thing in with the theme of big data.
Well, then what good is big data if you can't have it perform when you query your giant, super
Mark,
multidimensional
if
cube?
you've got your multidimensional, cube off to the side, if it takes 5 days to run a query, that's okay.
Yeah, but PerfBytes listeners, you might be interested in licensing changes or new virtual user types or integrations. Nothing new as of yet. So keep your.
But we should mention that HP is a major sponsor of SIP-P.
They are actually. I think they were original inventor, and there was a discussion a long time ago about taking SIP-P and integrating it into Load Runner as a virtual user, as custom virtual user.
That would have been a good solution, I think.
You could still do it. It's just not built in. It would be cool if it were built in, though.
Mark, the next one is a pickup once again, something that we missed, which is Visual Studio 2013 was released back in mid-November, along with Visual Studio 2012 Update 4, and for those of you who are using using Visual Studio Ultimate, you know that there are some performance test capabilities in this product, and it really goes along with Microsoft's philosophy of you're not really a tester, you're a dev who happens to test.
Yes.
So they kind of fold together. If you embrace the Microsoft development model, testing model, the tools are kind of built around that, and that's really it. No real news except, hey, new release. Mark, did you see any new features that you wanted to cover in there?
Basically, if you're a Visual Studio user for load testing, most of the guys I talk to who are .NET shops, they're very happy with the tool. And the licensing is quite unrestricted. But you can only get this web load testing capability in Visual Studio Ultimate MSDN, the most expensive, it's not cheap. It's not cheap. Microsoft software.
If you want to test in that Java Oracle universe or
on a Mac,
site-based SQL Server, or generate load from an Android phone or something of that nature, well, you know what? They're Microsoft.
Yeah, it does work. I know some shops that are Java shops that have guys use Visual Studio on VMs and they do their thing. But again, no real major announcements coming out of there. There's already cool stuff within the whole Visual Studio world for tracing and stuff with production, but I haven't seen any companies actually embrace that from a DevOps perspective. But it's really cool sounding DevOps automation. So that's pretty cool. But James,
and by the way, we should also point out that Microsoft claims 100% market share in 100% Microsoft shops.
That would make perfect sense, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
It does.
Yeah.
The next one, Mark, is kind of an artifact. We all remember Y2K and all the functional issues associated with that. I'm going to subtract, 68 from 0 and get minus 68 and things of that nature. But a lot of code out there implemented what was called a sliding window to address these issues associated with addition and multiplication, where you cross 2-digit years. And guess what? We're now coming up on about 6 years until the sliding window issue needs to be fixed.
Yeah.
Most people implemented a 20-year sliding window. So we're going to call this the YK20 problem. And Mark, I think this is something that we should talk about on a regular basis, because think of all of the dollars and effort was expended for Y2K to make that really a non-issue from an IT perspective. well, all this code needs to be updated once again.
Right. A non-issue if you expected that you would either be retired or dead by the time 2020 came around, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's fine. This will be the quick fix in 1999 at the last minute. And it turns out it was a non-event. And now in 2020, we're going to have a whole nother resurgence. So if you haven't, major upgrades and migrations,
So Mark, where do you think we'll go for COBOL expertise to patch code this time? I know this was really the huge dawn of Indian outsourcing and Indian IT, the Y2K problem.
Oh, yeah.
They were very proficient in COBOL, being able to bring these solutions online, patch code. So where is the COBOL universe now? Is it Vietnam? Is it Brazil? Is it Greater Indonesia?
Well, two things are going to be a problem with this. One, we'll either forget that none of it was documented, so nobody's going to know how to fix it again, even though it's been fixed once. So the sliding window you'll have to go in and fix again. The second thing I will say is, if it really took a bunch of old white guys to fix it in the first place, or come up with the re-architecture, we might have to get into sort of the Frankensteinish reanimation of deceased flesh in order to bring these people back from the grave and fix it in like 2019.
Well, Mark, Grace Hopper would have turned 107 this last week.
I know. I tweeted that out, actually.
Yeah,
she was great.
I think she's been passed away for a number of years now,
Yes,
so I
sure.
think that whole reanimation thing, probably not a good idea.
Probably not, unless you've got a backup somewhere on tape. All right, so that's the not so newsy news. At this point, we're going to take a break kind of early for our good friends at Nuco, our sponsor, and then we're going to fade back in, and you'll go right back into part 2 of Virtual User Tips and Tricks. Does that sound good to you, James? You all right with that?
That sounds good to me, Mark.
Hosting for PerfBytes.com has been provided by Nuco, New Centers of Excellence in Performance Engineering, PowerTest Professional Services, The Script Farm, LoadRunner by the Hour, Videratech, Cloud Architect, and No Load Test. For more information, go to www.newcoe.com or call 703-856-8187.
All right. Let's jump back into views or tips and tricks. Let me do a little review, of course. Tim, what's the definition of a virtual user?
A virtual user is anything that is simulated and, I guess, headless, in my opinion.
Headless, like the Headless
Horseman.
The Headless Horseman. There's a show called The Sleepy Hollow, right? There's a new TV show that actually is this.
Yeah.
I saw this. It's on American TV. James?
Yes.
Do you know you're familiar with Ichabod Crane and the Headless Horseman?
I am from my nightmares as a small child.
Really? And just a short recap for folks that maybe did not listen to our last episode, which was on the tips and tricks, the famous tips and tricks. One of the main things that grounds everything you do when you're building a script is going to be what, James?
Pinning it to your load profile.
Load profile. We've also heard it called usage profile or workload model, something like that. To describe what that is, actually.
Basically, it is your mix of user behaviors on the system. If you look at a system at any given point in time, you will have some users who are casually browsing the site. You'll have some users engaging in a particular business process. Take an e-commerce site. We're putting stuff into the shopping cart, and then we're abandoning the cart because we don't like the color of the cart. We're going away.
Yeah.
And we'll have some users that go all the way to checkout and give us money, revenue producing users.
Yeah.
And that mix of people who are casual users, engaging in some portion of the business process, completing a business process, that's really our mix of transactions or workload profile. And our goal is really to represent what a user is doing kind of en masse across the user spectrum for a high load condition.
Well, and it could be different things. You and I talked about an episode where we talked about different performance test types, stress tests, soak tests, spike tests. And so different usage models, like if you take an e-commerce model like you talk about, could have a promotion like this Cyber Monday just happened recently, where you've got a spike in promotional traffic on the site. Another thing you might have is a back office system that's, got an everyday, sort of working in the accounting department, and it's a steady state. Maybe the morning has a hump, maybe a bimodal curve for the workload throughout the day, maybe a peak hour in the morning, peak hour in the evening. It could be a mechanical system. So whatever the usage is, the transactions and the different, say you've got 10 different transactions, they go at different rates. That usage model really guides everything before you write a script, before you hit the record button on anything. Put yourself in the context of what's meaningful to the business. Why are we even doing this test? And is my script going to meet that goal? So, Tim, with that in mind, any thoughts on tip 0?
Well, if the listeners have Google Analytics, there's a pretty good workload model right in front of you in Google Analytics. And a tab that I really like in GA is the behavior flow, which shows users sort of transitioning through your site. And you can see where users are jumping off and how many visits are going where. But I think that's a really good starting point for people if they don't know where to start.
Sure.
They've got their finger in the air kind of thing.
Yeah, and if you don't have Google Analytics, you might have a production APM system. Could be the HP, the old Topaz stuff. I'm going to date myself. I still use the word Topaz. But I love Topaz. I thought it was a great name. But there's also Omniture, Dynatrace. Sometimes you've got the Dynatrace stuff you could use in production. There's also other if you've got New Relic, or even from the Splunk side of things. James, you mentioned you love logs. I know you love logs, brother.
Yeah.
So really, you could either start intentionally with the usage model, from really working from what's important to the business and then figure out what people are doing, or you could kind of work backwards from a log or from something in production. The important part is why something is happening and why is the business interested in that, right? So adding items to a cart and things like that. So that's a really good point. Google Analytics or any sort of production monitoring could give you that. Okay, so let's jump into another set of great virtual user scripting tips. James.
Mark, have you ever seen a script which uses the phone book for names, for parameters?
You could write a script that actually calls out whitepages.com and does a random search?
No. I'm actually thinking about one time when I walked into an account and someone had an extract of the Seattle phone book that they were using as a data file.
As an input file.
As an input file. What people don't realize is these files have to go in RAM when you run the test. Yeah. We're not reading from disk any longer at that point. We're trying to avoid these things. So consider a minimal data set for the complexity of the data that you need. A good example really is names. With a very small number of first name, last name, and middle initial combinations, you can actually have a fairly large data set that can fit into RAM very easily. I set out 75 first names, 75 last names, 26 middle initials, gives you 140,000 unique name combinations. If you add that to address, there are more than one John Smiths in existence. You're going to get a pretty unique set of data.
Yeah, cardinality-wise, it'll still be valid.
Exactly.
Yeah, well, the other thing is just use native functions. Like for a username, I often just do, load dash timestamp, whatever the equivalent function in the tool I'm using at example.com. And unless if you know the application is not validating, say, the domain, you can get away with very sort of small memory requirements for large combinations.
Exactly.
This
is just good programming practice. We want to minimize our resource set for generating load, just as we expect the developers on the other end to minimize their resource set for doing the workload.
Yeah,
it makes me think also that Tim, your suggestion of actually having sort of a common prefix, or you could even do a common suffix or something in the middle. There's another advantage here of sort of limiting it to have something that's searchable. So if you ever needed to sort of reset the database, but you really just had to delete a bunch of records, you could actually put together the search and delete cleanup script to actually go through, find those accounts based on the same code. So you may have a total set of random characters on a very small subset, but have like 3 of the characters in the middle totally unique, or a suffix or a prefix that's searchable in the database, so you could actually back out those records. So this is pretty important if you're actually doing your load testing in production in the live site. So you're adding real new records that are dummy records, but you want to back them out at the end of each run.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing that I often do is modify the user agent header as well, along those lines, just to distinguish that this is, traffic coming from a, artificial source like flood.io. And that helps, DevOps guys sort of, either ignore or grep out those sort of entries from their web logs and that sort of thing.
Yeah, you could purge them, right?
Yeah.
Purge them out of the,
or at least
the logs
ignore
completely.
It.
Yeah. So getting back to the usage model again, and this is really important. We want to drive this home with our listeners to keep in mind that it's easy to get lost, as you can hear the 3 of us just talking about all these geeky functions and cool parameterizations, and scripting is really fun, actually. If you like it, you might be kind of twisted in the head like the rest of us, but it actually is really, it can be very, it'll consume your attention. So to get back to the business, get back to that usage model in the real world, when you get a script that finally runs, that actually kind of works, it flows, it commits the data, if that's what it does, don't forget, go back and look at the throughput controller, or iteration pacing. In the load runner world, it's iteration pacing. That's how I know it. But it's also like the constant throughput timer, or the throughput shaping timer in JMeter from the JMeter plugins. And also understanding that configuring the arrival rate for throughput, as well as think times in the script, kind of have to go together. So that opens up a can of worms if we try to make that script behave from a pacing standpoint according to the usage model. Tim, I'm going to throw it on right in your can of worms here, the difference between iteration pacing and think time.
Well, I guess iteration pacing is obviously the timing of each iteration of a particular V user within, like say in JMeter world, that's a loop, or one run through the scenario. And so iteration pacing, if it's used correctly, is kind of takes into account all the time that it took to process all those requests. So the actual think time and the actual server processing time, and then iteration pacing needs to sort of take that into account so that you can keep control of it. It's not just something that you add on to the end, and that can be hard to do. That's easier to do in tools like Load Runner, because it takes that into consideration. If you set too aggressive pacing, I think it throws a warning in the V user logs. And so doing it with tools like JMeter and Gatling, it takes a bit of work, and you need to understand what your tool is doing. And the best advice that I have for people is they sort of go from nothing to full on. They've got like 10,000 users running, and they're trying to make sense of the load, and they've never actually run like a baseline, with just a couple users or 10 users, just to get an understanding of what the script is doing. Because it's an imperfect sort of science, I guess, is what I'm saying. You need to obviously run it, test and adjust and run it again until you get that sort of workload right. And then think time is really just a specified interval between transactions. And in JMeter world, they're sort of scoped to wherever you've put them in the test plan. So you can put think time right at the top with, say, a Gaussian random timer or something like that, which I like to use because it gives you sort of variance between two times, like a fixed delay and a varied delay. Or you can scope it to an individual request, so just by adding it as a child. So it really depends on where you put it in the test plan. So you can. Yeah. It's important to note that I think a lot of people miss that in JMeter, at least, that you can scope these sort of timers wherever you place them.
Yeah, and there's different testing approaches where people will leave think time out completely. Yeah. They'll leave pacing out, and the idea is that the test is going to run 1,000 iterations of transaction X, and if it can run 1,000 iterations in a minute, then we know the throughput was 1,000 per minute. And if you run this, hang on, this, and the next build of the test of the app, you're going to run the same script for 1,000 iterations, and let's say it runs in 45 seconds. That means it ran faster than the night before. So some people really use a no pacing, no think time approach. But the only place I see that being successful is at sort of a unit level, and it's only running maybe a small 10 users. It's not a real-world usage model kind of thing. It's more like I'm taking sort of a as fast as it can possibly go kind of test, which is good in the unit level because you're looking for race conditions and thread blocking and all sorts of things that are happening, technically at a very, very tight level in a dev environment. So the closer you get to the real world, you're going to have to, don't forget, you've got to have, to simulate that usage model, think about that iteration and pacing and think time. James, I know you're just itching to say something here.
Well, Mark, if you get a 25-user version of a commercial tool on an evaluation, if you take all the think time out, that's equal to 10,000 users.
And that is not only an entire other show, but probably an entire bottle of scotch to get through that. The last one here is a tip. I'll hand it to James on what if you can't record. James, what do you do?
Well, there are situations where maybe the interface or the product or the client isn't built yet. Consider maybe you have a device that isn't yet constructed, but the web services calls that are coming out of this. And in this case, you're simply going to reproduce a series or a sequence of web services calls that represents a business flow. You can think of the number of devices that are out there or applications that run on top of Android or iOS that are thick clients on the device. They don't generally have a full, rich contextual conversation with a back-end web server. They're not bringing display elements. They're just sending little discrete bits of information, getting discrete bits back. But if you don't have the entire application built, how do you test it? How do you test that infrastructure?
And the thing is, you might be taking a guess that it's like, well, here's my sequence of 4 or 5 web service calls. And if we take those same API calls and move them into someone else's app, because the idea that, web services can live in the wild, and someone could build a new app against your API, and you have no idea really how that app's going to go. You might even be testing more mechanically at, what's the maximum throughput for that one web service call. And devices, it's interesting you bring up mobile, because I think the biggest difference here is whether you start pulling back some of that payload under high latency. But you may just need to write the script, and that brings us back to our Ruby JMeter stuff. But Tim, what's your experience with just, there is no recording, and you've just got to dig in and start writing a script?
Yeah, often I find like I'm still testing a web app, and we can use a recorder, but I choose not to. And then the other reason might be, say, I'm looking at metrics from a third-party site like New Relic, which is giving me a nice information about requests per minute, and it's giving you sort of web transaction overview. But it's at the sort of controller level, if you know what I mean. Like it's talking about routes on a website, and they don't necessarily line up to how I understand the application works. So you sort of have to reverse engineer from those sort of aggregation sites and go, well, these transactions are the fingerprint of this sort of business process. And so in those cases, you sort of deconstructing or reverse engineering, a business transaction. So you've never used a recorder. You just go, okay, well, I need to make these, this call and that call, a couple of AJAX calls here, and that constitutes this particular transaction. So, I often, like I said, not using a recorder at all. I often sit with just Chrome and the network panel. It's a pretty good, cross-platform way of doing things, and I can sit there and just copy-paste, say, form parameters straight into JMeter, or we can use the Ruby JMeter DSL and just sort of build stuff that way. And so that's often one way to approach it.
Do you ever go back and check at any point, just to make sure you're not it's cool if you're actually dissecting the client to figure that out. But sometimes you'll miss sort of something that gets rendered in JavaScript, and maybe it's a dynamic third-party call. You may still want to go back after you get kind of the basic script running and do a sanity check. I do this with Charles Proxy just to say, or Fiddler, just give me a trace and say, wow, what calls did I miss anything?
Yeah, almost.
Because
I think it's a good practice to do that. Like I do the same. You just run it through a proxy, in this case, like Fiddler or Charles or whatever, and compare the traces with a real user transaction. And it's normally pretty obvious what you've missed.
Yeah, right on. All right, so that's the first collection of tips we have about scripting and sort of approaching your scripting of virtual users. We're almost to the bottom of the hour, and that means, James, you know what time it is.
Yes, I do know.
Okay.
Hello, PerfBytes listeners. It's your old friend Satan here. It is with great esteem that I'm proud to introduce this week's edition of The News of the Damned.
Can you dig it?
Screaming, still screaming, because he's being punished by yet another website that crashes under load.
Well, there's some screaming on the part of a lot of fans
Really?
this week of Jay-Z's wife. Beyonce released, to the surprise of many, an album in the wild on iTunes, and not being very polite, I don't think she coordinated with Apple before she did this.
Yeah, you might have given a shout out to your techie geeks who keep the websites up on iTunes before you just...
Yeah.
She didn't just drop the mic. She dropped the website on the whole freaking thing.
Yeah, I mean, Mark, I think you saw some stats. You were looking at 80,000 downloads in 3 hours. There were tens of thousands of tweets going out.
Yes.
All around the world. Probably a good portion of them were saying, hey, iTunes is down. Beyonce, twerked the website to death or something of that nature. Or, excuse me, that would be Molly Cyrus twerking the website to death.
That's not... we, by the way, James and I do not advise anyone to twerk their website. That's...
No.
We don't. I don't
definitely
twerk.
Not a good idea.
No.
Servers generally don't respond well to that.
But again, here you've got celebrity making a move, which they've got... How much PR and marketing and planning went into this whole thing, and you just assume that the internet and all of the people that keep the internet running are just your slaves. You're just your minions.
From what I've read, she's been working on this while she's been on a world tour.
Yeah.
Over the last 18 to 24 months.
That's impressive.
So, it included video, audio, text liner style notes. So all of this was being put together, but nobody, for whatever reason, decided to coordinate with Apple.
Also, I gotta say, the guys at iTunes, this is where, if you're only looking at existing traffic on your projections for capacity planning, and you don't have a what if scenario, you don't do a little bit of what if Beyonce, what if Jay-Z, what if Kardashian, what if Miley Cyrus, what if, the capacity planning guys at Apple have to figure this out. Too bad. But she still sold, 80,000 in 3 hours on a crashed website.
I know.
I mean, good Lord.
Just imagine what her revenue stream would have been had it been up.
I know. It's crazy.
So next up, speaking of Google, actually involves Google India. Google India had to issue an apology recently.
Oh, I like that.
Because of something called the Great Online Shopping Festival. So Google was trying to put together kind of a marketing event involving, I think it was a little bit over 260 different vendors, all sales on one day, and kind of a shopping experience. So you bring all the vendors together, you bring all the people together who are interested in the vendors. And Mark, what do you think happened?
Kaboom! Once again, Google, the crash. It crashed, yes. Just goes down.
Yeah, and they did not learn from what happened just a couple of weeks prior with the Google subsidiary corporation, Motorola.
Yep.
Where they had a similar style crash due to high load.
I wonder if these guys are running Google code. if they're actually running on the Google service infrastructure, or if these are just like Google hosted VMs, or if this has, if Google may be related to this, but it's not even running on Google infrastructure. Because to me, this doesn't sound like
Google. Since it was Google India who apologized,
I suppose
I get the impression it's probably running on Google infrastructure.
There you go.
Next up, a company called Drop Till You Shop.
Ooh.
Reinvented the clearance rack concept online.
Okay.
So what they've done is they bring overstock and clearance items together, small lot sizes, and they've created kind of an instant demand or an instant bid model where you're having like 60-second auctions. So think of eBay and that last 60 seconds where you have all these people coming together to compete for the item because they're waiting to the end because they don't want to bid it up before it gets to the end because they might get a really good deal on it. Well, in this case, you have a constant instant demand model for that last 60 seconds of activity. And of course, this really brought the site down because instead of having an auction ending at kind of chaotic intervals, they're online and ending all the time.
So you're just kind of surfing, fishing, if you will. What's the next thing put on the rack? And you got 60 seconds to say, I'm in, click, 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 done.
Yep.
Ooh.
Yep.
Yeah. So it's
so you're minimizing that delay in end user activity, which is kind of inherent in the client server model of, when I back off, someone else is using my resources. Well, in this case, you're encouraging people to use as many resources as possible almost all the time. And so they've got to think about what they're doing very, very carefully in terms of resource allocation, or site's going to fall over.
Yep. Kaboom. There you go. Yep.
And the last one is really kind of interesting. Mark, you found this one, and it deals with personality. There is a official in the NFL by the name of Jeff Triplett.
That's the National Football League here in the States.
National Football League, so American football, National League of American Football, whatever it's called overseas.
Yep.
American National Football League, whatever.
Yeah.
He made what fans consider some questionable calls over the course of a couple of games.
Yes.
In short succession. And this resulted in fans wanting, I guess, to express themselves.
That's a kind way to put it.
to Mr. Triplett.
Yes, they wanted to share their opinion.
Sharing their opinion or moral support or whatever. And going to his website, which happens to be a site dedicated to providing kind of officials in this area. It's called Arbiter Sports. Triplett is the president CEO of Arbiter Sports, in addition to, putting on the striped uniform for NFL games.
Yes.
Kind of cool. Working CEO in that sense. So all of these people coming to let them know how happy they were with his officiating actually took out his website.
Took out his website just like that.
Yeah.
Boom. I got to say, and he posted his, he's the CEO of his small company for officiating, right? And he wrote quite a lengthy apology letter online. And listen to this paragraph, James. You're going to love this. All right. He says, "We know that you have time-sensitive responsibilities and that your ability to serve your clients is adversely affected when our website is inaccessible or unacceptably slow. We apologize for the events of the past week, as well as the slowness of the website at times during this past fall. We are working tirelessly to remedy the situation, exceed your expectations, and maintain your trust." That paragraph is brilliant. Everyone should just copy and paste that instead of the error message on a 503 server busy. Just put that up there. And
you're right. Just replacing the 503 with that.
With that paragraph? Oh my God! I felt I felt touched.
Right. You're right, Mark. Did you have a tear?
I did. I felt really valued by the fact that this person cared so much that they were working tirelessly. After all my late night load testing in the labs, I know what tirelessly means, and I can tell you these guys are not working tirelessly. But it sounds good anyway in an apology letter, so thanks for that, Jeff. Appreciate that.
Yeah, maybe, Mark, I think we should link to this story, which includes this paragraph, in case any of our listeners want to take advantage of this and change their default messages for server busy or 404, something not found, or 500. Yes. And, that would at least show that they're aware of the situation, even if they're not really, because they're not looking at it. Yes. But at least it would make the customer feel all warm and fuzzy and, bring a tear to their eye.
The Arbiter Sports Jeff Triplett 503 apology. That's how I'll post a link on the PerfBytes page for that. James, thanks again for the News of the Damned. Once again, we've come to the close of the end of the 2013, and in our closing episode of the year, we'll actually go back through the News of the Damned, and we're going to have to choose a News of the Damned person of the year, or maybe even company of the year.
That is going to be tough, Mark.
I know.
I've been struggling with this, and I think I've come up with a model for number of people impacted.
Okay, so that's News of the Damned. James, we're going to wrap up our V-User tips and tricks. One of the more complicated or advanced things, Tim, is combining protocols within a script. So what's your experience with doing that and different tools?
Well, often it's my experience has always been sort of mixing, say, web and database, and potentially something like LDAP as an example. So that's probably the most common sort of use case I've come across. And I guess sometimes you might mix protocols if you can't. I'm just thinking from my load runner days. Yeah. It's been a while, but if you can't achieve a piece of functionality with say a traditional V-user, HTML-based script, you might have to switch to a different protocol to achieve something else. That might be a way to have mixed protocols.
But why? I mean, a lot of people record an app. Doesn't an app only use one protocol?
Well, no.
Well, that's becoming more common, Mark.
Don't all jump at once.
I mean, set up Wireshark and have a look.
There you go.
Look beyond HTTP is my advice. You'd be surprised what's coming out from your workstation.
So, James, you were going to say.
Yeah, I mean, it's becoming more common that everything is based upon web technology as a carrier.
Oh, yeah.
At the transport layer. But as we've gone through the evolution over the years, we've seen database and something else, and yet something else more exotic. Sockets and COM together.
Oh, God.
Something over something.
Corba and sockets or something.
Peanut butter over jelly.
Peanut butter over jelly. Exactly.
That's backwards, isn't it? Most people put the peanut butter down and then put jelly.
Well, these are clearly not performance testers now, are they?
Well, they could be.
So we've seen some web and WinSock over the years, particularly where you have like screen scraper applications.
Well, look at RMI. RMI over HTTP versus RMI, XML, over SOAP kind of stuff. Any of the web service infrastructures are encapsulating any other kind of protocol can usually be sent back and forth. Streaming is a whole other ballgame, right? So streaming protocols over HTTP. And so as these things start to mix, you might quote unquote get away with just web or HTTP, but there's still a packet to unload out of that, or at least a set of objects that you could deserialize out of that.
Yeah, I guess the other problem is sometimes you hit like a commercial app, and it might be like a thin desktop client or some variant, and you have no idea what protocol it's going to be.
Yeah.
The latest ones I've seen are these manufacturing applications which run on phones, which are a combination of web services and telnet.
Could even be terminal traffic, yeah. James, go ahead and introduce our next.
Measurement. If you can't measure it, you can't improve it. And so this comes down to transaction timings, how long something takes, and not only base transaction timings, but nested transaction timings, small pieces of the transaction.
Okay, so Tim, right now you should interrupt James and ask him what the hell a nested transaction timing is.
Nested transaction timing. Nested transaction timing for me is like the movie Inception. And it's just a whole world of pain when so often I see people on Flood doing this, and having timers within timers in terms of scope, and I say that's great, you can do that, but please just try it with one user once again, and just understand what it is actually doing, because when you start to sort of cross the streams, bad things can happen with this.
And that's a shout out to Paul Miller from HP, whose Twitter handle is Cross the Streams, who's also from Australia. Actually, I think he's from he's from Malta, actually.
Yeah, bad things happen.
All right, James, go ahead.
This gets back to one of the earlier recommendations, is to pin everything to a requirement. Simply adding these sub-transaction timers inside of base transactions has very little value if you're just doing them, for the sake of doing them.
Yeah.
You want to be able to pin them to some sort of requirement, be it a technical need or a business need, that is going to provide value in the information that comes out. Otherwise, you're just spending a lot of time putting in little markers that no one is ever going to look at or care.
Yeah, I would say, in the tip that I would say is it's okay if I think of how JMeter, like every sampler is going to give you some kind of result, but you may want to wrap it in a transaction controller to sort of give you 5 or 6 different steps that become an end-to-end wrapper transaction. And actually, there are auto timers that you would have in the runtime settings in LoadRunner where each one of those those steps would get timed, but you would have an explicit start transaction, end transaction around a set.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Tim.
I was going to say, tip for young players, if you are using the transaction controller in JMeter, which is like grouping similar transactions under a parent, the default setting, I think, is to include the duration of the sub-timers and pre and post processes. So that can often cause mass confusion because, if you've got like a think time Gaussian random timer or whatever sitting underneath that, the scope of that parent, and you're wondering why your transaction is taking like 6 seconds, well, that's just that little checkbox.
Yeah, it could be 5.3 seconds worth of think time sitting in there.
Exactly, yeah.
It's the same option actually in the runtime settings on LoadRunner and also in SOSTA. The idea that you would exclude think times, but make sure you preserve the usage model and the throughput, as you do this. So don't be afraid to nest transactions, but understand, it starts to get more complex at that. I'm going to punt this over to Tim, which I have no idea whether he has anything to say about.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Third party calls. Tim, what's your take on sort of taking that recording that includes all sorts of calls? And whether you would, what's the best practice? What advice would you give to somebody that gets a really fat script with all these extra calls?
Well, look, it happens all the time. We see this on Flood all the time, and I'm sure a lot of our Flood nodes have been blacklisted from, third-party sites like Google Analytics. But I think the best approach to this, and this is why I encourage using some form of, man-in-the-middle proxy or whatever to sort of vet your scripts. Because what I like to do, once again, with Charles, is I just replay, even if it's a customer script, I'll just replay it through the proxy, and then I'll just get a summary of the domains that you've hit. And more often than not, there'll be things like analytics and, support sites and all these sort of third-party sites, which really don't appreciate being flooded, so to speak, with load testing. So it's really important to do that, not only because of the, terms of service with those third parties, but sometimes it's not really the objective, or it's not actually testing your infrastructure to that end. So sometimes it might be valid as part of your control sample, for example. Like you really do want to get a measure of end-to-end sort of response time performance, but definitely not sort of uninvited third-party load testing. Yeah.
All right, James. One of the biggest things that could be problematic when you're building a script for the first time is that you don't know what the heck the driver is doing at all. So what can you do on debugging?
Just about every tool on the market, open source or commercial, supports some sort of debug message facility. Take advantage of it. Use it everywhere you want to. Be promiscuous in its use, because when you go to run it, debug is not going to be engaged when you go to actually run it in production. So take advantage of all of these capabilities to actually debug your own code, your own script, while it's in the development phase. And feel free to leave these things in as comments for other users as well. Just about every tool on the market has a debug capability in terms of either variables for watch lists or messages that you can actually output while your development is ongoing for your code, your test script. Take advantage of it. Be verbose. Use them everywhere.
Yes.
Use them as comments, because when it comes time to actually execute the performance test, debug messages are going to go into the ether.
Well, that's true. I mean, depending on the tool, sometimes logging is the same whether you're building a script and when you go to runtime. But one of the advices would be to disable logging when you go to run at scale, especially very, very large load tests. And that's a kind of a best practice as well. But when you're building your script, turn the logging on. Actually see what the heck is going on. And that's one of the main things, the first things I do when debugging a script is like, really, what's the problem? And one of the frustrating things in JMeter is like, if you're doing bean shell scripting, like you can hardly figure out exactly what line of custom code. I'll almost pull it out and stick it in actual Java to actually debug what that script is doing in the context. So it's really hard to figure out exactly what's happening. So you add these extra logging features in there, especially logging things that are affirmative, like I made it to step 4 successfully, and you have some tests. You almost have tests built in to the script itself. But yeah,
I bought a pair of Reebok shoes for £0
Did you really?
No, but that's a great message.
I just bought a product for $0. That would be good. Yeah.
And Tim, this gets to your issue of maybe it was a tester who made it a zero value cost.
Cool. All right, so Tim, I'm going to let you wrap up with one of our last tips here, and maybe your thoughts on actually scaling the capacity for a given virtual user script.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's, like how do you estimate the resources required for a vUser to run? And, one option is to run a single instance of the vUser and measure the memory and throughput. Other options are to, run sort of an arbitrary amount, because often, I think that one user is probably fairly representative with tools like LoadRunner. But I know with, say, JMeter or anything that sits in a JVM, you want a bit more load to go through to get a measure of performance.
Sure.
And the other thing, it's quite a common question for us on Flood is, people ask, well, how many users can I run per grid node? And unfortunately, the answer is it depends.
Yeah.
Because it depends. It depends on test plan complexity. It depends on the target site latency and how it's performing. There's a whole bunch of things that can affect, I guess, how a load generator is going to perform. There's no straight answer. Like we say, as a planning figure, you can use 1,000 users per node. But, our own benchmarks, which we've publicized on the blog, test JMeter up to, say, 10,000 users on a node, and we've done Gatling up to 40,000 users on a node. So
sure,
it really just depends on the test plan.
And it depends on the test plan in terms of, like, when you say test plan from a JMeter's perspective, it's like, what are all the calls that are included? Let's say you started throwing JDBC samplers into a JMeter script. That driver has different overhead compared to, say, a web services or a SOAP request.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, and the same thing in any tool. In LoadRunner, if you're going to load, let's say, take a classic example of like a Citrix virtual user that's loading an entire ICA client. Or, Tim, you mentioned before about maybe using WebDriver. Like in the latest JMeter, you can do WebDriver. You're running a full-on browser engine that could be 30, 40, 50, 100 meg, depending on the app. So each virtual user takes up a huge amount. It's a big question that I've seen for years is, what's my virtual user footprint? And like you say, in some tools, go ahead, James.
And it can even vary from developer to developer. You get a more mature test code developer, they can produce a very sparse resource virtual user Whereas a new developer that doesn't have a whole lot of mentoring or a lot of training, they could wind up with something very large. A classic example is a ASP.NET with large view states. If you're not reusing your view states, you could very easily wind up with a virtual user that's tens or perhaps approaching 100 megabytes in size in memory before you get to the end of the iteration and you start dumping stuff for the next iteration.
Yeah, another thing to keep in mind, like you say, Tim, when you start running stuff, like with ANCC, you don't quite have the same memory management issue, but if you're running something, a Java virtual user or something in JMeter on the JVM, you're going to have garbage collection. So there's one thing to say, run one virtual user and see what the total footprint is. And, if you have your JVM settings on JMeter at 2 gig, even if you run one thread, you want to look at the heap used, not necessarily the total heap size. So you might have to actually do, take out the debug parameter in JMeter to see what's actually happening there from a GC, which is my point. When you run 10 threads or 50 threads, go through a smoke testing phase before you commit to some serious load tests and take a look at what's happening with garbage collection in the test tool. And this may not directly apply to Flood.io or other, sort of JMeter-based tools out there, or even other custom tools. This idea that running one virtual user, it's an app just like any other app. It's sending requests and it's running multiple threads and it's got memory management and it's going to be reaping that memory. It's going to be reaping connections. It's going to be going through GC cycles. So the test tool itself has a scalability characteristic, and starting with one thread for the memory footprint of that vUser, and then running, let's say 10 threads, running 20 threads, just small number of views. Just see, how much you can get running on one machine, depending on what that script is actually doing. And, the next script you write, like James says, could be totally different. And if you get somebody else who writes a script in a different way, it could be totally different. And so, yeah, it's not cookie cutter by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah. We use like a red unhappy light, which we flag on the grid nodes if someone's smashing
the frowny
out of
the frowny
CPU.
light.
Yeah, so it's normally like a visual indication that's need to look at something, but more often than not, it's just users have forgotten to take out those debug elements, especially any former listeners. Yeah, anything which is sort of like sucking stuff into memory and not releasing it is going to be bad for a performance test run at production volumes.
And this is a good tip to kind of wrap up our scripting tips on, because it sort of leads to scenarios, tips and tricks, because like you say, monitoring the load generator and seeing whether it's happy or unhappy. One of the things I know, James, you're a long time posting to the threads and forums is you need to be monitoring your load generators, and also maybe even having a what I call a canary script, a single thread running on a separate load generator just to check and balance against the credibility or accuracy of a given scenario. So, James, maybe you can describe what this canary script approach. It's a metaphor, right? The canary in a coal mine.
If we pin it back to kind of test 101, Mark, you're really talking about a control set.
Sure.
I really like to have a minimum of 3 generators involved in any performance test. I'll tend to stage primary load on 2 of the generators, and I'll use one generator, hopefully they're all hardware matched, with just a single virtual user of each type of business process. That way, while the test runs, I can watch the behavior of my control set compared with my global population, and if they both degrade in performance at the same rate, I know that I have a common cause. It's likely to be the application.
Right.
On the other hand, and I see this quite often in tests where we have a real small number of generators and a large number of users, is my control set will continue at the same rate or get a little faster while my global times are degrading. And what that is telling me is my load generators are oversubscribed.
Right. Which kind of leads back a little bit to how that script was designed, because if you're and the fact that it's over consuming or overutilizing the resources for the large load generator, which is indicated then also by the the fact that even if it's large, it's the loaded load generator is actually showing degradation, whereas the control does not.
It is an axiom that poor performant code, whether it's test code or application code, will scale to fill the available resource pool.
Marvelous. Tim, any last thoughts on that tip?
No, I mean, it's you've always got to be suspicious of your own scripts. It's healthy to be that way because, as all the listeners would have done before, they've been to walkthroughs or, talking and spoken to the devs and, saying that this API is not performing or whatever. And the first thing that's going to get shot down is your own test approach. So you need to be 100% confident that works.
Right on. All right. Fantastic user scripting tips. We've got 2 episodes worth of fantastic tips and tricks for virtual user scripting. It's time to read some inbox, some messages, some emails that were sent in. And this was Peter from the UK writes in an email. And Tim, hopefully you'll help us answer Peter's question. He writes in a question for us. If my virtual user script needs data to run, should I stage the data in the database before the test, or should I find a way to feed the data dynamically into the script on the fly? What's your advice there?
Well, I think he's asking, like he's sort of hinting towards data-driven tests. Mm-hmm. And I think, from our other episode, like my preference is for static sort of reference data to try and generate as much of that as possible from within the script itself before falling back to an external source. And then if you need to go to an external source, it's normally because you can't generate it easily from within the script. In terms of dynamically, should I find a way to data dynamically into the script on the fly? I don't know. It just depends on your use case. I mean, we provide mechanisms to do that. But really, I haven't really got a clear answer on that one because it just depends on the use case.
Yeah, and it depends on what the app is doing. Like if you're in step 4 of a transaction and there's different user personas, you've got somebody in sales and origination, another person in accounting, another person in underwriting, another person in delivery. You've got different roles and they may have different sessions. So you have session 1, which is user A, and session 2, which is a totally different role. I need the data from the system, but let's say those other parts of the system are not part of my test. So I think Peter, you might be in a situation where you're sort of chopping up different roles and testing just some of the roles where there's sort of staged data. And my tip would be, if you have control over the database where you can sort of flashback or restore the database back to a starting state, then if that's easy to do, if you have good support from your database team, go ahead and stage the data because you can flip that database back and repeat your test. And I think that would be easy. If you don't have the ability to flip that database back and it's a roadblock, it's a headache, then think about having a feeder script that kind of sets up invoices or sets up that stage data kind of on the fly. Maybe you even write a separate script that kind of feeds that data. And then there's different sharing mechanisms, depending, like some kind of IPC communication between 2 scripts, different thread groups within the same script, or you're actually using a VTS, virtual table server, or name pipes, just passing data between the scripts in order to do that. So there's no one right way or wrong way. But Tim, I think to your point, there's an overhead whenever you have to go outside of the test tool thread to get data externally. There's some overhead, either in memory or I/O time, to get that data and pull it in. So if you can do it inside the script, all by itself, sort of self-sufficient running thread, that's going to be the most efficient load generator. So anytime you have to reach outside the driver, outside the thread, then that's going to have some overhead. James, what are your thoughts?
I'd like to put some caveat on the statements that you just provided, Mark. Mm-hmm. All great advice, except if the database that you're getting the data from is also part of your application under test. Because what is going to happen in this case is you're providing an extra set of load to the database, which is not there in production. And arguably, those queries are not going to be optimized. They're not part of the production query set. You're going to be providing a disproportionately large load just in pushing and pulling your test data to a server that would not have this load in production.
So you might skew the results by having this additional feeder load.
You would absolutely. Now, if you want to extract the data and put it in a different database, which is not involved in your application under test, you're still going to have that cost issue of going off test to get the data. And you might have to have that as a broker between different phases of a business process as data is transformed from a field salesperson entering it in at the car to someone who's looking at it when you get inside the organization and filtering out various components to go to different divisions.
Right.
But you avoid the cost and the overhead of your actual impact to your application under test. That's the critical, bar do not cross.
Yeah. Be aware that if you've got some sort of utility script that's feeding data, that's going to maybe add load that may not be there in production. It might be that there are, people adding invoices over in another department, and you're just calling the same query, and it might be legitimate. So I would say, performance-wise, if you want to keep it clean, if there's any way to stage that data and you're just running your thing, that probably is the most clean measurement you can come up with. James, Tim, thanks very much for chiming in, and good luck, Peter, on your scripting.
Well, PerfBytes listeners, once again, we've come to the close of yet another brain-rattling occurrence of PerfBytes. Time to get your caffeine and settle down after this one. We certainly do appreciate the time you've taken to listen to the show today. And I also want to have a shout out to a couple of people who are important in my life. Thank you, Mom, for tuning in, as you always do.
Yes.
And I want to say a happy birthday to my younger brother.
Happy birthday to Mark. And of course, I will give my moderately intimate thank you to the sexy Irish voice of PerfBytes and congratulate her on getting her proposal passed to get her dissertation so she could become a doctor.
Woo!
And of course, special thanks to Tip Koopmans once again for joining us on this part 2 episode on Vuser Tips and Tricks. It was great to have Tim not only as our guest host and friend, but also as a sponsor from Flood.io for joining us on this episode. And we hope to see him in the future.
And Mark, today's episode is powered by the heat of the volcano at the center of our secret lair.
That's Evil James, right?
Yes.
Yes, of course. And keep in mind, PerfBytes listeners, that all of the content of the PerfBytes episode is protected by Smog, the dragon, who is sleeping on our hoard of tons of old LoadRunner install CDs and compact hard drives. Don't mess with dragons. Seriously. They will hurt you. That's bad.
For more information about PerfBytes, please visit the show's website at www.perfbytes.com. You can also visit us on iTunes, search for PerfBytes, and you can visit our fan forums on Facebook and on LinkedIn.
And of course, the PerfBytes show and staff are all supporters of the Performance Engineering Book of Knowledge, the Computer Measurement Group, and of course, the Software Test Professionals community of software testers. James and I will both be at the Software Test Professionals Conference, STPCon, in April of 2014 in New Orleans.
New Orleans.
It's a great place for a conference. We're going to have a great time. We're going to be doing a live show, and come check it out. Our next episode might be the last episode for the year in 2013. Please join us as James and I will review the News of the Damned person or team of the year, event of the year.
Exactly.
So thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll see you in the next episode of PerfBytes.
Have a great week.